So I will say I'm doing something that I very, very rarely do. This is actually the lectionary passage for today. So one of the really, I think, significant things in that is as we read this, I think it's worth noting that churches all around the world who follow the lectionary will also gather to read these same verses. So this is Acts chapter 2, 42 to 47. It says, they, the church, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and they had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So if you have that in front of you, you can keep it open. Keep it open in front of you. I do think that's a great thing. Because what I want you to do is kind of scan the passage, scan the text that we just read. There still are 5 words that for me, as I read this passage, and even like no matter how many times I read it, leading up to this morning, leading up to preaching on it this morning, still come crashing into my mind and still come crashing into my heart when I read them. And I hope, like, no matter what, moving forward, no matter how many times I read this passage, they still will, I think, kind of grip me and take a hold of me regardless of where I am. And so I'm not going to make you guess which 5 words they are, but we can kind of play it out. We can play it through, right? So maybe you'd begin here, and maybe this would be the assumption made of many pastors. 5 words, added to their number daily, right? What person doesn't want their church to grow? What pastor doesn't want their church to grow? Absolutely. Do we want this for our congregation? Yes, in all of the ways you can imagine, but not the 5 that kind of hold me when I read these lines. How about this? Everyone was filled with awe. And that line even includes, and I didn't include it in the 5, signs and wonders that the apostles were performing as the church gathered and worshiped and worked out their faith together. Again, that sounds great, and it is. And do we want it for our community? Absolutely. Not the 5 that I'm talking about today, not the 5 that I think are the maybe most immediate importance to us. Devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. That one is actually 6. Okay? Again, it's great. And so maybe you read it, you're like, yeah, well, dude's a pastor, and so that's probably what he's talking about. Not the words, again, that I'm referring to. Plus, I cheated there. That was 6 and not 5. My math doesn't always math. The words that hit me the hardest are these: with glad and sincere hearts. With glad and sincere hearts. I don't know what it is about our cultural moment. Man, I don't think I'm alarmist. I don't feel alarmist. But I also don't think I'm alone in feeling it. Feeling that I could use a little more glad and sincere heart. Whatever that looks like. Like whatever it looks like to have a glad heart, to have a sincere, like sign me up. Where do I put my name down? Like where's the course that I can take? What's the thing that I could do more? Like that to me, glad and sincere heart, whatever it is, more of that. Or whatever that fountain is, like I'll bring a cup and I'll start drinking from it. Like that to me is what so many of us need. And I think what the world needs more of right now. And listen, like maybe I'm off. I could be completely off. Maybe I could be completely projecting. But these words, they ring in my ears because as much as they're this perfect image of how we are supposed to be as people who exist on this side of the resurrection, as people who look back and celebrate Easter and celebrate Jesus' life and his teachings, study his teachings. And then as people who are impacted by his death and his resurrection, I don't always see it. And listen, I'll be the first to say I don't always see it in my own life. And you probably just need to commute once with me along the 403 to feel it. I don't always feel like I have a glad and sincere heart. And I wonder if you feel it too. John Stott wrote, Christian writer, theologian, "The Christian community is a community of the cross, for it has been brought into being by the cross. And the focus of its worship is the Lamb once slain, now glorified." The focus of our worship is Jesus. That's it. We gather to worship Jesus. We work because of what Jesus has done and what he has accomplished. Like, that is the bedrock for the church. That is the foundation. The Bible puts it this way. That's the cornerstone of our faith. Is Jesus' life, his teaching, his death, and his resurrection. John Stott says, like, listen, this is if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, and even not, this is the moment in history that matters most. We are an Easter people. He continues, so, the community of the cross is a community of celebration, a Eucharistic community. I love that. It's a community of celebration. It's a Eucharistic community. Eucharist means thanksgiving. When you dig a little deeper into that word and how it came to be, it actually roots itself in grace. Eucharist, root word there is grace. And it is thanksgiving. It is gratitude for the grace of God. And so he continues, we, the church, we are a community of celebration, a Eucharistic community, ceaselessly offering to God through Christ the sacrifice of our praise and thanksgiving. The Christian life is an unending festival. And the festival we keep, now that our Passover lamb has been sacrificed for us, is a joyful celebration of his sacrifice, together with a spiritual feasting upon it. Listen, like that quote, it's a lot. And I always wrestle or try to decide how much of a quote should I share in a sermon. That one felt like it needed to be all of it. But a couple of the things that are highlights for me is that the community of the cross, the community of the church, is a community of celebration. We are one that gives thanks. We are one that praises God, ceaselessly offering, okay? Praise and thanksgiving. And then it's a festival. It's this unending festival. I think what it's pointing us to, this quote, so we take it and kind of use it as a lens to help us think about Acts chapter 2, is the fact that in Acts 2, as we read about this early church and some of the things that they do together, it's meant to help us understand that it's not just because of when they were or who they were that those things were important. Or the fact that the church ate together with glad and sincere hearts. It's not just a throwaway line. It's not just because that's what they decided to do as the community of faith in their moment. It's meant to be captured and held and understood as like core to who the church across all generations is meant to be. It's not as byproduct of some people who enjoyed being together. It is core to who the church still is. In order to understand, I think, what Luke is telling us about the early church, and Luke wrote Acts, we have to understand that we're dealing with two things, really. Gladness, on the one hand, and sincerity sincerity of heart, sincere hearts on the other. And I think what can happen when we start talking about being glad or being sincere is that very quickly we can adapt or we can interpret those things as happiness, gladness, happiness, and then something along the lines of trustworthiness or truth. Right? What does it mean to have a sincere heart? What does it mean to be sincere? Even to be without deceit, right? The problem with those understandings, I think, and what happens, go down the gladness and the sincerity route, is that those understandings are rooted entirely in who I am, in who you are, right? Experiences, our own expectations, and so on. They're very personal things. And when really what Luke is trying to write is something more core and invitational, foundational even, to each one of us, to our identity as the church. But he's not just saying that the early church was happy about who they were and happy because they knew Jesus and that they trusted each other and that they operated inside of truth or sincerity of heart with one another. Like, those things sound great, and I hope that they would be true. But that's not at base level what Luke is trying to get at. And so I like to look at it this way. And this is the wonderful thing about having multiple translations of the Bible. And so I read from the New International Version to begin with, and I want to read you the same verse from the New Living Translation really quickly for us this morning. I said two Bibles in a book, so in 42 again, it says, in very similar fashion, all the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to sharing in meals. This one even says, in parentheses, including the Lord's Supper. And they also devoted themselves to prayer. A deep sense of awe came over all of them. And the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders, and all the believers met together in one place, and they shared everything they had. They sold their property and their possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity. So those same words, glad and sincere hearts, here are rendered with great joy and with generosity. Joy and generosity. Again, I love it. Like, sign me up, right? For more joy and for more generosity. Like, I think each one of us. So when we break down, I think, what goes on in the early church, I do think it becomes clear that John Stott, in talking about ceaselessly offering our praise, our thanksgiving, our worship as a festival, a celebration, he's onto something. They devoted themselves, it says, to the apostles' teaching, to the teachings of Jesus. So it's Jesus' command, right? Teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. Like, take my teachings that you have learned and continue to share them. They devoted themselves to the teachings of Jesus. They devoted themselves to fellowship, to being together, to community. You think like Fellowship of the Ring, right? Lord of the Rings, like together with a purpose. Okay, fellowship, community with a purpose to their being. They committed themselves to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper. They committed themselves to prayer. And I think it's important to prayer together. And what happened? You see, again, like, we're so quick to go, and at least maybe it's just pastors. Maybe it's just like insider information. They're so quickly to go, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Okay, awesome, but we missed this step. What happens? They're filled with joy, and they're moved toward generosity. They embrace a generous spirit toward one another and toward the world. Locating yourself, ourselves, in the things of Jesus should move our lives toward a spirit of joy and toward a spirit of generosity. And if I could flip that just to help us understand for a second, if you want to see how closely you are becoming like Jesus, look for the joy and the generosity in your life. There's a book by James Bryan Smith. This book, in fact, I'm sorry, but I'm just walking all over the place every Sunday. So you walked out of the camera, you walked out. This book right here is called The Good and Beautiful God. And then the subtitle is Falling in Love with the God Jesus Knows. And it's a great book. In this book, the author tells a story about one of his friends who traveled a lot for work. Right? Some of you travel a lot or have traveled a lot for work. Maybe you're going to, this story might hit a little too close to home. Story is this: the friend traveled a lot for work, ended up stranded in the Atlanta airport while flying back to the United States from Germany. How many of you have been stranded in the Atlanta airport? Okay, we got a couple, even Atlanta. How many of you have been stranded in Pearson Airport? Like, the Atlanta airport is huge. You could get lost in there for days. So stranded in the airport. Listen, Germany to Atlanta, that's a long flight. Still not home at that point. And so what ends up happening is the flight kept on getting delayed. And then eventually, you can guess, it was canceled. And what happens when a flight is delayed so far, like flights stack up, and then eventually it's canceled, is everybody lines up at the same kiosk to rebook your flight. And here's, you know where this is going. How happy is that line? How full of gladness and sincerity of heart is that line? Joy and generosity? Like zero, right? Like everybody is angry and anxious and scared and like, when am I going to get home? And maybe you've got something that you need to be home for. Like maybe you're flying for a very urgent reason. Like those lines are filled with a whole lot of emotion. And what ends up happening is this, and I want to read you a little snippet. When it was Craig's, that's the friend's turn, he looked at the woman standing at the kiosk, and he smiled. And then he said, "I promise I am not going to be mean to you." Her countenance softened, and she said softly, "Thank you." Their exchange was pleasant, and he got their flights booked for the next day. And here's what I want you to hear. As they walked down the concourse, Craig was smiling despite the disappointment. His business partner had been watching him. He said, "Craig, I've known you for a long time. A year ago, you would have been enraged by what we went through today. And you would have lit into that woman at the counter." Craig said, "You know what? You're right. But I have changed. I know who I am. I know where I am. I am a person in whom Christ dwells, and I live in the kingdom of God, the kingdom of a God who loves me and is caring for me. I'm frustrated, but I'm still at peace." He said, "We'll get home tomorrow. There's nothing for us to do. Anger doesn't help anything." That last line sounds a whole lot like Jesus, right? Enough worries for today. There's nothing for us to do. That's the picture of joy and of generosity. You know who you are. You know the love that you have received from God. And it's a love that settles your heart. It's a love that settles your mind. It's a love that brings you peace and allows you to live with a generous spirit toward others. In the last days of Jesus' resurrection, throughout the Gospels, there's this common theme, this recurring theme, this interaction that repeats itself, this image over and over again. And we looked at one of those images last week in John 21. It's an image where Jesus shares a meal with his disciples. They've gone to fish, then he meets them on shore. He prepares a meal for them. And it's in the sharing of the meal together that the disciples become aware that it is Jesus before them. In Luke 24, Jesus appears to the disciples. And again, like the disciples are afraid. They think he's a ghost until he eats with them. And it says their minds were opened to understand. A few verses earlier than in 24 is actually my favorite post-resurrection meal. And we talked about it last year on Easter Sunday. It's the road to Emmaus. And it's an interaction between Jesus and two disciples where they're walking. And what we find out early on is that their vision is constrained. They can't see that it's Jesus. They don't understand what's going on. And then we pick up the story. They're walking to the village. Jesus continued a little further. They urge him to stay with them. He says, listen, stay with us. It's nearly evening. Day is almost over. So he went in, and what happens? He was at the table with them sharing a meal. And he took bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it, and then he gave it to them. And this is what verse 31 says. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And then immediately he disappears from their sight and they run back and they tell everybody, hey, we saw Jesus. And in 35 it says, the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. How Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. And, I read Acts 2, what becomes very important to the early church, and I read these stories of Jesus showing up and revealing himself to his disciples over and over again by sharing a meal with them. And I think to myself, I can't help to think that there is something about Jesus sharing with the disciples, being generous with the disciples, giving to them, that encourages and allows their eyes to be open to who he was. They were able to fully understand. Sharing a meal with Jesus, it wasn't just a nice thing to do. It wasn't just because they were hungry. It wasn't just even a reminder of the Last Supper. It's a sign of God's grace, of his giving spirit toward them and toward you and toward the world. And what we do when we share meals is participation. Participation in the grace of God in the world, to the world. And it's participation in God's grace with you, I believe, is what ends up enabling you to experience joy and generosity in your life. Participation in God's grace is what allows you to enter into that glad and sincere heart. It's what allows you to be settled with who you are, down to the core of who you've been created to be. And I do also believe if there's ever to be a balm, a healing salve that the world needs right now, it's that same spirit of joy and generosity. Because you and I, we know you've experienced the opposite. The opposite, as I see it, is anger and cynicism, and maybe a little bit of a sprinkling of fear and selfishness. And that's not the way of Jesus. And it doesn't sound, to use John Stott's language, like an unending festival. But gladness and sincerity, joy and generosity, that sounds a whole lot like Jesus.